Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name's Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. Today, I have a conversation with my friend Jacob. Jacob is a friend of mine that I know from the Discord, and if you can't tell from the title, or is it down here? I don't know. If you can't tell from the title, he's got a lot of strong, interesting, maybe controversial opinions. I asked him to come on to talk about women in the Torah and kind of give his perspective on females and what the Torah says about them, and why he thinks it gives a lot of respect to women. And it went all over the place, as I should have expected. But I really enjoyed the conversation. I felt very grateful that Jacob was willing to share his opinions and felt comfortable to do that on my podcast. So you might not like some of the things he has to say, but I hope that you listen because there's definitely a lot of interesting things that he has to offer. Hope you enjoy. Jacob, thanks so much for having a conversation with me, coming on my podcast.
My pleasure, Cassidy.
Yes, I've been actually wanting to have you on for a while, so I'm glad I finally was able to fit it in. But before we get all started, why don't you just give a brief intro? Who are you for people who don't know you, or anything you think is relevant?
Sure. So I'm the mouthy Jew on the server. I am Jewish, and I have a channel where I teach biblical Hebrew and talk about my off-the-wall opinions. I think I have a pretty unique way of looking at a lot of things, and I'm quite loud about it.
Yes, so. that is true. Out of anything, yeah, but it causes a lot of intrigue in conversation. So
I like to think it's interesting.
Well, great. So let's kind of get started. I asked you to come on and talk about women in the Torah because I know sort of culturally there's sometimes people who think that the Bible or the Torah has a negative view on women. And I know that for you, you think the opposite. So I'd love to kind of hear your perspective, especially since you are Jewish and have a lot of knowledge of the faith, sort of how you see the Bible interacting with this idea of the feminine.
Okay, so I think part of what really rubs me the wrong way about the Apostle Paul, who's one of my favorite people to criticize, is I think the view he has of the relationship between men and women is not biblical at all. And so I am unapologetically sexist. I believe that men and women are very, very different from each other. And I think that the Bible very much does look at men and women like we are different from each other, because we are. That's obvious. At the same
Is that sexism? Is that what you think people mean when they say something sexist?
Well, I'm also an unapologetic feminist. I think most people, when they talk about sexism, they mean that you think men are better than women.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's ridiculous. I think in our society, we just naturally value women more than we value men. That's, women and children first, right? And that's what gets me into trouble with like the men's rights activists, which is fine. I do believe that women have a privileged role and should have a privileged role in society, which at the same time, suddenly all, the equality feminists want men and women to be treated the same. I think that's wrong in every way. And I compare it to putting your right shoe on your left foot and demanding that your left foot like it. It doesn't work that way. If you treat your daughter the same way you treat your son, um, excuse my language, you're an asshole. And I mean that. If you treat your daughter like you treat your son, you are not a good parent. You are a bad parent.
Give an example of what that would look like in the world, like where it would be a bad idea to treat a woman child like your man child.
Okay, so here's my attempt at getting your channel permanently banned off YouTube.
Oh, wonderful. I should have known this when you came on, Jacob.
When I was in undergrad, my first year in college, there was a young student. She had skipped a grade, so she was only 16, I believe, and living in the dorms. And she went to a fraternity party, and she went home with one of the students, and he raped her. And that was crushing to her, as somebody who cared about her. It was crushing to me as well. And part of what bothered me the most was everybody was willing to say, yes, what happened to her was wrong. Nobody was willing to say, you know what, we as a society should have protected her better and not let a 16-year-old girl go to a fraternity party where a 20-some-year-old man can invite her into his home and rape her and get away with it. Because guess what? There's no way you're going to be able to prosecute that. It's he said, she said. He's not going to get prosecuted. And now this 25 years later, we're trying to actually prosecute that as rape through all kinds of weird and illegal manners, whereas as a society we have to simply say, look, 5,000 years of society wasn't trying to harm women. There are real differences between men and women. And if we ignore those real differences, the first people who are going to be harmed are women. That's just plain wrong and unacceptable. And people don't want to talk about this. They don't want to have an honest conversation about this. And this means how many women are being raped? How is this in any way acceptable? Our young girls, the women in our society are being hurt by all the lies. Part of my practice, I'm an insurance agent. I have a lot of trans clients. The number of females who are now going through being trans has gone through the roof. Anybody who's paying attention needs to realize there's something going on here. Jonathan Haidt, it has all kinds of statistics about how we are harming our young girls. And am I the only person who finds this completely unacceptable? We need to be protecting the little girls. Yes, we protect little girls more than we protect little boys. That's how society is. That's how society was. And to some extent, yeah, that goes against everything that feminism has tried to do for the past 60 years. Guess what? I don't care.
That doesn't surprise me, Jacob. So let's back up for a little bit, and before we kind of go further down that road, what are you, like, in your opinion, where you think are these distinguishes between male and female, and how do those sort of encapsulate these idea of masculinity and femininity, as we express them through culture?
Okay, I mean, I think biologically there are certain things that are just simply true. Women, um, so one of the things when I had Anthony on my channel, which I brought up, is um, it's just a biological fact that the distribution of any characteristic, right? You're going to have female mammals more along the average, and you're going to have a much flatter distribution of males. So men tend to be taller than women. But when you're talking about 7 billion people, the shortest human being is always going to be a man.
What is that?
Because when you're looking at the extremes, the curve is so much flatter by males that even though the average of males is higher than the average of women, anytime you're looking in the tails of the distribution, anytime you're looking in the extremes of any characteristic that that makes sense to do this type of analysis for, you're going to have, you may have some females in the extreme tails, you're not going to have very many, and you're definitely going to have more males. And that's why, if you look in the Guinness Book of World Records, the shortest human being is still a man. That's just how it is. So what we've been doing recently is talking about how we don't have enough females in the extremes. Yeah, you're not going to have female as many female geniuses as men, and you're not going to have as many female morons as men. That's just how male biology, male mammal and female mammal biology works. And if you don't like that, I'm sorry, but it's just a fact. So when people start asking, well, why don't we have as many female chess grandmasters as we have male chess grandmasters? You're looking at an extreme. You're always going to have more males in the extremes because male life is more expendable. We it within mammals, it's much more important that females not end up with extreme characteristics which can be harmful, because female life is so much more important than male life. And our society has actually believed that for thousands of years. And over the past 50, 60 years, we've decided we don't want to know this stuff for some reason, and that somehow it's acceptable to have ideological opinions about about how things should be, which are not grounded in facts. Yes, I believe that no, what is is not what necessarily should be, but when you look at what should be, you have to start with what is and what is possible.
Okay. So as you sort of see it throughout the history, you think in the past there has sort of been this privilege of women as the more valued sex, the one that needs to be more protected, and then men are more expendable. And as you see it now in sort of the modern frame, do you think that has switched, or do you think that that's still sort of the case, and while feminists won't acknowledge that, they're fighting that. I'm just trying to understand your perception of how it is now, sort of in our modern frame.
I think in our modern frame, we are doing a lot of things which purport to be something which they are not. So we are claiming that now we value women more than they were valued 60 or 100 years ago. And I think we're doing the opposite, because now a successful woman is a woman who is successful as a man.
Mm.
The standard of success for women has become being masculine and masculine traits. Uh, this idea that women can be everything a man can be, right? Well, what made men the standard for what a woman should want? It's just insane to me. If
Mm.
and honestly, like, so we tell young girls that they're going to be happy with a high powered career, and I think all of us know women who have strived for that high powered career, achieved wonderful things, especially women who went through med school. And I mean, lots of women I know who went through law school, business school, put everything, and then in their 30s start the their biological clock starts telling them, this isn't satisfying me. I want to have children. And for a lot of them, it's incredibly difficult now. They're no longer as fertile as they used to be. Their kids are more likely to have all kinds of health problems because they are older. And we've institutionally betrayed all these women. There's a reason why uh, I believe less than a fourth of women call themselves feminists. Well, why is that? Because feminism has betrayed women.
So where do you think in sort of the line of feminism you feel it started to betray women? Was there ever a point where there was a good part of feminists? Because you call yourself a feminist. Um,
I do, because I do think, and honestly, I think this comes from Roman and Greek culture, um, as opposed to Jewish culture. Judaism taught monogamy and taught that um, male sexuality should be contained within marriage, which was news to the rest of the world, right?
yeah.
And so within Jewish culture, it's understood that the head of the home is the female. And you see that in the Bible, right? When Sarah wants to kick Hagar and Ishmael out, God says to Abraham, listen to your wife Sarah. And Rashi, who's the basic commentator on the Bible within Judaism, the first commentator we teach our children, says because Sarah's level of prophecy was greater than Abraham's. So, and we believe this, that within the home, the female is a keret habayit, literally the essence of the home. And it's not that a man is king of his castle. It's that a woman is queen of her castle. She is the mother. She is the essence, the foundation of that home. And honestly, when I read things like in Paul, he says women shouldn't speak out, and the male is the head of the home. It's it's honestly, it's a complete reversal of everything Judaism teaches. And when you look in the Bible, there are very strong women, right?
Right.
Miriam is, it was a strong woman. The matriarchs, uh, Rebecca, she was a strong woman who knew how she wanted her house to be run. And the view, I think, that was adopted, especially in Christian society, where women were seen as secondary, should have been challenged, and it has been challenged, and that's good. Definitely, I believe that women should be allowed to pursue whatever they want, just like any human, you know, fe- women's rights are human rights. I sincerely believe that. What I think is completely deplorable is the idea that a successful woman is a man. That's
Mm.
just, it's wrong in every way.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I have in the last year or so, and just about in the last maybe 2 years, I sort of got this questioning and this challenging of what is masculinity, what is femininity, and what do we mean when we say those things, and how are they represented in culture? And yeah, the more you start to really think about it, you have in culture this um, abhorrence to toxic masculinity, these extremes of what it means to be masculine. Yet when those toxic masculine characters are put on females in film and television, what have you, it somehow becomes empowering. And yeah, there's a bit of this sort of shift where it's like on a man, it's it's not good to have these masculine characteristics, but if a female puts those on, it becomes, yeah, the epitome. And so there's still this sort of masculine first look at things a bit. And I don't say that confidently because I think for myself, I'm still kind of wrestling with this idea of masculine and feminine because for myself, I'm a woman and I don't think that I'm not feminine, but there are a lot of things about me and my personality that tend towards masculine qualities. Like I work in a masculine dominated field and I actually feel like I love it and thrive in it. And I, I spend a lot of my time on the internet talking about philosophy and religion in sort of these intellectual ways, which I wouldn't say is necessarily what we would assign as feminine. Um, but there's just this weird balance in this game of like, how does that work and how does that sort of play within um, sort of our cultural narrative, but then there's this whole biblical narrative too that's going on. And I'm obviously a Christian, so I have a bit of a different perception of Paul than you do. But yeah, just sort of playing with those ideas of what are the stories that we're getting through these biblical narratives and sort of whether it's the church fathers or the patriarchs and how they lived. And I think sometimes the bigger question is how are they getting misrepresented in our, like when looking at them through our modern lenses. Does
Well,
that
one thing I want to ask you about
Oh, okay.
is when I was growing up, some of the greatest comedians were women. Roseanne Barr, Joan Rivers,
Mhm.
um, uh, Phyllis Diller. I mean, you could keep on going and going. And what I don't see really anymore is these female comedians. They seem to have disappeared. I don't know why that is.
Mm, Now I'm gonna cancel myself. um, so I have uh theories about this. Mm, okay, I'm gonna say it. I might get in trouble for it, but I'm gonna say it. So I personally haven't found a lot of stand-up comedians that are women that I find exceptionally funny. sort of in this level of the extremes. Like, why don't we see these extreme of really brilliant stand-up comedians in the way that we see with males? And for myself personally, like, there are funny women, and I think there's a lot more funny women in television and sketch comedy and other mediums than in stand-up. So it's not to say that I don't think women are funny, but I don't tend to think that there's a lot of these super funny women on the level of some of these other male stand-ups. And I do think there is a part of the feminist movement and this um, wanting of more women to have that opportunity that has actually been a disadvantage for women in comedy. So, how stand up comedy works, most people spend years and years slogging it in little clubs where they bomb multiple times a night sometimes, and just really have to go against the grain to like hone their craft. And 10 years later, finally they'll get a break, and then it'll start going. But they've had all of this time to work it out in the clubs and go through all of the ups and the downs of what it means, like the boot camp of what it means to be a stand-up comic. But because people want to look um, progressive, they want to support women and give women more opportunities. A lot more women, because there's not very many who want to do that job or who are um, working actively to do that job, get pulled out before they're really ready to be in a more public sphere. They haven't had enough time to really work out all of these um, things in the club, and that they're weakened by getting the attention too soon. And I think that's more why we see a lot less funny stand-up women than we do men now, because they just don't have the same adversity that you need to really be an exceptional stand-up.
Okay, so my question then becomes, why it seems so many people have stopped being funny though.
Mm.
Sarah Silverman used to be hilarious, and she just seems, to have lost her ability to be transgressive and funny.
There, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think part of it is one, it's the internet culture of now any joke that you tell can be taken out of context and eventually go out and ruin your career. Like, there's part of that where it makes people take less risks in comedy. And a big part of comedy was always sort of the pushing the barrier, pushing the line, testing the boundaries of what was appropriate. And so there's part of that. There's another part where, with the, and this also goes into the internet culture, but with the constant 24/7 media, comedians have to create far more content than they ever did before, because they tell a joke once, when they go on tour and they make a special, they can't ever tell that joke again, which was not the same really for other other comedians. It's just gotten harder, where it's like now every year you're having to create a totally new set, where comedians before didn't necessarily always have to do that. So they really got a chance to practice the same thing over and over again, perfect it, and then put it out. Um, Comedians don't have that luxury anymore. And they really have to be masters of all. They have to be podcasters, they have to be social media experts, um, brilliant marketers, and wickedly funny, and have a stage presence and a look. And so there's just a lot more of that, I think, stretching people from the art of what it is to create jokes and create these one-man shows. um, and it does a disservice to it, but that's one of the trade-offs of this exposure mechanism of the internet.
Yeah, and I think part of, I mean, a large part of what you were talking about, that fear in order to get to that line, you sometimes have to cross it and see, oh, well, this went too far. And now if you go too far and it's caught on videotape, you're gone.
Right. There's not much forgiveness for that. And so then you get these two sides of the comedy coin, the sort of antagonizers where they're going to push the line and, not give an F. And then, the ones who are going to walk the line and do sort of what is culturally acceptable.
Right.
And there's this balance, but I mean there's a hard part of it too where there's a certain level where you can play it safe and in this middle ground where it's far more difficult to be funny. Like clean comedy is so much harder to do than sort of the blue comedy, and that's why not very many people do it because it's a very difficult world to wrangle.
Right.
And I think it goes to the same with some of these going against the cultural grain. It's easier to go with it and build a career than go against it. And when you're trying to make a living out of it, and that's how you're relying on your paycheck, it really becomes easy to cater to that. And it may be relevant for a time, but it eventually fades out and stops being funny, because I think the things that are timelessly funny hit at something incredibly like incredibly attached to the human experience. um and you know and some of those things can transcend time periods, but we don't live we don't live that way anymore. We live in the now. We live in the clickbait culture, and so it's much more about getting clicks than creating value.
Honestly, I've um, basically, as far as film and television, unless lots and lots of people tell me something is good, like I went and saw The Joker.
Mm.
Um, Anything made in the past 10, 15 years, it's just become so formulaic that I don't even bother with it. I binge watch old things from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. You watch Archie Bunker and the Jeffersons, and they're able to actually address the type of racial problems that we should address, or even, also the questions of gender and sexuality. um, it seems that those things from my childhood, and they were in reruns in my childhood, um, they seem to actually, you know address important issues much better than things that are being made today.
Yeah, I think television goes in cycles. um and it really just sort of depends in the place we are within these things. Like right now we're kind of at this weird turning point in media where the gatekeepers are slowly losing power and new media is coming up and creating this space for this vacuum that's been gone. And so there's a lot of hands in the pot in a lot of these creative endeavors that sort of turn art into a consumerism machine. And so it's easy to get to these formulas because to get the funding you have to prove that you can make money. And with TV and television it's all kind of Vegas. um
What do you
as
think of what do you think of PewDiePie?
I don't know enough about PewDiePie. I think from what I've heard, um because I know that he's had some like controversy with some of these things, and it seems like there's yeah, a lot of misrepresentation or confusion going there. But I don't know. There's this weird, um, I don't know. There's this weird thing with YouTube and what becomes popular. But I've only watched little bits of what he did, what he's done. So I don't have a ton of thoughts about him. Like, what are your thoughts?
So one of the things, I mean, my nephews are kind of my guide in this, and they love PewDiePie. Like, so, and they were quite impressed that their old uncle even knew who PewDiePie is. And I have deliberately tried, even though obviously I'm not his audience, I've deliberately tried to understand PewDiePie because, yes, he did get canceled. Like, he had precisely the type of, he's basically been identified as some sort of white supremacist, horrible thing,
Right.
to the point where YouTube no longer acknowledges one of their, I mean, he has like 100 million subs,
Yeah.
and YouTube refuses to acknowledge his existence anymore. So he's never in the rewind anymore. And so he's been officially non-personed, which to some extent seems to have actually given him more cred with the younger audience somewhat.
Well, they're
And
anti-establishment.
yeah, and the funny thing is that he is so incredibly wholesome. Like, it is the most wholesome comedy you could ever imagine. Like, and he he recent well, not too recently, but he got married to his girlfriend, and it's it's really, really wholesome comedy. And he it's just him, and he has an assistant, and that's it. The two of them creating content every single day, right? And I think his videos are like, I don't know, 5 to 15 minutes long, but that type of production every day, um it just makes me wonder, you know it, it seems to me that somebody like him, and for a little while, and this is how he got canceled, there was this idea of getting, a studio and lots of assistants, and allowing him to do, lots of different things, and magnifying his voice. And that's when he got canceled. But he's uncancelable. I mean, what do you do if they were to kick him off YouTube? Like, he has 100 million subs, and his fan base will simply just, I mean, I'm guessing if they were to kick him off YouTube, they would lose 5 million YouTube subscribers permanently. Like, these 5 million people, including one of my nephews, would never go back to YouTube, right? And he, how do you cancel somebody that it's just him and a friend in his living room, right? It's it's kind of amazing that you have somebody that small creating things, which, I mean, the studios here, I mean, I live in Los Angeles. um, CBS would kill for the numbers that PewDiePie has. He,
Yeah.
I mean, especially the demographics that PewDiePie has.
Right. Well, it seems like from what I've seen of PewDiePie, he just does weird, absurdist comedy stuff, which is um kind of a lot of that is was the birth YouTube was the birthplace of that. I grew up sort of at the beginning of the YouTube age and the golden age of vlogging and all of that. And I think there's something within the young generations where it's not about the good production design or um the stories that are trying to tell you what to believe or how to believe. There's something about recognizing people as they are people in their bedrooms, in their like small whatever, creating things and sparking that ability in you to believe that you might be able to create too. And I don't think it's always about the narrative or um all of the person. I think there's a hard part too, because again, I don't know all about the PewDiePie stuff, but there's a lot of politics going around in some of these platforms, and a lot of people talking confidently about the character of other people without understanding the full context and the full story. And I think a lot of people, if they go and see PewDiePie or watch what he's doing, like even briefly, they can kind of go, this doesn't seem to compute with that narrative of he's some white supremacist.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. He's to his fans, he's kind of a buddy.
Yeah.
It's somebody they know.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to cancel somebody's friend is just one of the dumbest things you can try to do. But they've really done it, and you know, it's funny. The how invisible people like PewDiePie and Joe Rogan are to our mainstream culture, right? Um, the the New York Times reader doesn't know the names Felix Schellberg and Joe Rogan. They may know Joe Rogan,
Yeah.
but they don't know Joe Rogan from his podcasts, which is where his power lies. And it seems like there's a sleeping giant there that um, that the blindness I see in our supposed leaders is just depressing to some extent, uh, because there are all these people sitting in positions of authority who are supposed to be the cognoscenti. They're supposed to be the people who know. They are supposed to be the eyes of our society, and they just seem clueless.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole complication with the way all of this plays out and sort of um, the things that happen in these small circles of the internet. I think there's a big part of the circles that we're involved in the internet, and I could see how they could easily be mischaracterized as something different than as they are. But I think there's something, if you've participated in it and understand it, there's this little bit of hope that it's not all just division. It's not all people politically and religiously infighting or othering, and there is something different going on even within some of the conflicts that may arise in some of these things. But I also recognize how easily those things can be changed. And yeah, I think it was in some Donald Miller book or something. He was talking to some guy who did political ads, and he was asking him how easy it was to mischaracterize a person. And the guy was doing all of these ads in Washington. And he's like, it's unfortunate how easy it is to take a fairly decent person and make them look like awful or, just. And I think I understand that as a filmmaker and who has sort of this interest in documentary and the ethics in that there's a lot of things that we can do to put things together to create a narrative, and narrative sells. And so there's not only a money motivation and like a social job motivation, that comes in these hierarchies there, but there's also this thing that I believe where these narratives are so seeped within people that it's rewired their lenses to see through that and see those narratives, um, see the facts through those narratives. And so it's not just about facts and figures. There's a whole emotional level to all of that we as humans can't really escape because it's so in our in our wiring to process things through stories. And so I think it takes something major or drastic to kind of shatter those things. And sometimes that can lead to bad extremes on the other end. It's all very complicated. I don't think there's all easy answers to it.
Well, going back to what we started with, talking about femininity and masculinity,
Mm.
one thing that I was surprised when I found out about it, but it makes perfect sense, is that we believe aggression is uniquely masculine. And actually, no, open aggression is masculine. Women are just as aggressive, but they aggress against each other and against other people in a more covert, so through relational aggression, right? And when, so I think two things are really hurting our society. One is um, through the social networks that we have, especially on the internet, covert relational aggression has become so much more powerful than it was when anonymity was less possible. And second, I think there used to be a sort of culture of feminine um, relational maintenance, right? You had the women who were matchmakers, who were socialites, who were not just matchmakers in terms of, oh, you two should get married, but hey, these are people who should come together at a cocktail party. And part of our supposed feminism has been telling women, no, 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 those are not valuable things for you to spend your time on, right? And um, our society is falling apart partially because the glue that kept it together was femininity, was the capacity of women to help keep us together. And we've told all those women that no, 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 you need to become an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor. And our society is really suffering, I think, from a lack of cocktail parties.
So the solution is more cocktail parties.
I think more cocktail parties would definitely make our society better. And it's funny, but one of the things that some people tried to do to heal the type of partisanship that we had was just getting people together in a room to share meals together. There's something incredibly important about just face-to-face chit chat and hanging out together. And I think I think the repercussions of this past year, um, of wearing masks, not seeing each other's faces, not actually being present in rooms together, is I think we're going to feel the repercussions of that for decades to come. And I think people don't realize how much damage has been done. But frankly, I think that's damage it's just a continuation of not having cocktail parties for the past 50 years. Yes, we need to have cocktail parties.
That's going to be your political platform. More cocktail parties.
Yes, what's wrong with that?
No one can argue except the Baptists.
Well, I think a lot of people do argue with that. A lot of people seem to think that these these neighborhood block parties or whatever, just barbecues, just human beings getting together, um, we've just devalued it. We've devalued our relationships. I mean, I'm just finishing up The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist.
Mm.
And unfortunately, I think he tries to be just both an academic book and a popular book. And that kind of ruins both aspects of that. Um, I mean, so I wish he had just written the popular book that it could have been, because what the types of ideas that he is talking about and considering and forwarding, yeah, it may sound out of left field, but honestly, last night I took a segment of it and um, and sent it to Sam with copyright 2009, because he talks about how our society is becoming incredibly focused on preventing death and disease because we can't control it. And he wrote this in 2009.
Mm.
And honestly, the book is just prophetic about all the things that are wrong with our society. And I'm just thinking of telling people, you know what, forget the rest of the book, just read the last chapter. Because the first half of the book is really, really interesting. So he has it split into two parts.
Mm.
The first part is just a review on the science of the differences between the left and right hemisphere. And in the second part of the book, he takes all of that information, applies it to society over the past 2,500 years, and how there's been a sort of, it seems, dominance of the left or right hemisphere over society, that type of thinking in art, in thought, philosophy. And yeah, all of that review was very interesting, but the conclusions he hits at in the final chapter are what I wish everybody was actually paying attention to.
Mm.
Because um, he's showing a lot of, again, mental illness that our society is cultivating, and yeah, it bothers me.
So do you think that, and I've heard it sort of expressed this way, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, this idea of, you know, creating spaces for people to enter in is a sort of feminist trait versus this idea of men going out and taking action. That's sort of the way that I've heard it described. Is that why what you're sort of saying with sort of these cocktail parties of finding places to bring people in and bring people together and create that connection?
Well, I mean, so certainly in Jewish theology, especially as taught within the more Kabbalistic and esoteric tradition, there is this idea that the feminine is that which binds, that which gives a sort of shape, gestates, um, and that the masculine is that which breaks and that which transgresses and that which um, goes through boundaries. And I think regardless of whether or not you identify those with the masculine or feminine, we seem to have lost balance. We seem to have lost a lot of balance. And part of that balance simply includes the type of avarice, I would say, right? We seem to have this idea that, your net worth is some sort of like score in a
Mm.
video game,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
life has become that video game. And uh, it's funny, but actually, there have started to be these video games which women play a lot more, which are simulators where
Mm,
you're no longer actually trying to achieve anything, but you're actually in these simulators. You're just building a home, you're building a castle, right? You're arranging things. And um, yeah, I guess to some extent our video games have started becoming our imagination.
mm, mm. Yeah, I could see that. Um, yeah, it's sort of interesting because yeah, I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of pressure on women in our society um, that pulls us in all of these different directions. Where there's a part of you that's encouraged to, um, get the job, be an engineer, do be the breakthrough woman to do something great. Um, and then there's this other side too, where there's still this pressure of like being a mom and having a family and this idea of trying to have it all, and it sort of pulls you. And I could see how people could go into these simulated worlds and maybe they're not thinking it like consciously, but finding a way to have both.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think part of the problem is the fact that we've started telling people you can have it all, and we've told our children, yeah, the sky is the limit. And I think that's giving your kids too much of a burden of achievement, of it makes it impossible for them to be content
Mm,
with what they have achieved.
mm,
And this idea of contentment, right? Being able to achieve a life where you're happy, and it doesn't require you to be at the top of the hill. It just requires you to have those things that you need within your life. Um, yeah, we don't aim at contentment anymore. We aim at a sort of ordinal position, right? I have to be on top of the heap.
mm, mm. Yeah, I think it's very true for both men and women. We both have that sort of pressure in the society of we have to achieve and we have to be the best of something or create something, especially in millennial generation. That was sort of the narrative of like reach for the stars, go for your dreams, do something that changes the world. um and I don't know if you've seen Silicon Valley. It's but they have that sort of running joke where all of these tech companies are like, we're making the world a better place by you know software integration and like all of these things. But it's just such a millennial um, narrative. And yeah, I think there's a lot of people trying to wrestle with that. And a big part of sort of that meaning crisis of, hey, I chased this job, I did all of these things, I'm making the six figures, yet like I'm still not feeling that meaning. Um, so there's a lot in there, but I kind of want to try to pivot back to Judaism. So, what do you think within the practices of Judaism um, puts women in this prized place? Like, what are some of the things that they do to protect women within that practice?
So, I mean, it's become there right now. There is definitely a huge conflict within, especially Orthodox Judaism, because
And
generally,
are you still Orthodox?
good question. The thing is that unlike in Christianity, where your beliefs um, define where you are, In Judaism, there's kind of two axes, and one is axis, and one axis is your belief, and the other one is your practice.
Mm.
And I am not a practicing, observant Orthodox Jew at all.
Right.
The
Well, that's
synagogue I don't go to is Orthodox.
okay. Yeah, because I feel like there's a similarity in Orthodox Christianity with that, where it's right belief and right practice. But I think there's other probably Protestant flares and maybe Catholic flares of Christianity that are more propositional.
Right. So I my my beliefs tend to be within Orthodoxy, although I have a lot of weird beliefs, which is part of the reason I am not observant like I used to be.
Mm.
Um, I was for many years very observant. Um, but now there's been a, a definite push within Orthodox Judaism for female rabbis.
Mm.
And so there would be a lot of people who would say that, oh no, in Orthodox, especially what's termed ultra Orthodox, which is kind of a pejorative term, um, the less pejorative term is Haredi, which is Hebrew for basically God-fearers, right? And in the more Haredi circles, there definitely are communities where I feel that women are mistreated.
Mm.
I think that that is a cultural artifact, not of Judaism, but partially because a lot of these communities have retained the same beliefs that were prevalent 200-300 years ago generally.
Mm.
um, I mean, there are communities that I think mistreat their females, and those communities are always the ones that Hollywood decides they need to portray, as
Mm.
in unorthodox, which I haven't watched. Um, but I think that within actual Judaism, what I don't think the religion has ever been tolerant of this view that women are less than.
Mm.
I think, and part of the problem is that the only real problem with ordaining female rabbis is this feminist idea that somehow this is the sine qua non of equality. And honestly, I mean, when you look in the Bible, for example, Devorah, she was a judge.
Yeah.
Now, what does that mean, being a judge? Um, there's one particular woman, Nechama Leibowitz, who over the past, I think she passed away 40 or 50 years ago, but throughout her life, she was one of the most prominent Jewish scholars, um, really, I mean, with thousands at least of people who were dedicated students of hers. And she taught Bible in ways that most rabbis would be envious of her capacity to teach. She never had a position. She was a professor. All anybody ever called her was Mora, which means teacher, which is what all the teachers are called in kindergarten, right? And honestly, she embodied what I think is the Jewish concept of a female rabbi. Unfortunately, she didn't have any children. A lot of the most prominent rabbis were not able to have children. It just, you know, frees them up, kind of, you know, because having children is quite an investment. Um, but Nechama Leibowitz, in many ways, embodies just the perfect idea of a female rabbi. At the same time, there is a real reluctance to accept this feminist idea that we've been a patriarchy for the past 2,000, 3,000 years, because it's not true. I don't think that God was ever a patriarchal, you know, male chauvinist. And when you believe that the Bible is true, like I do, if I'm not shy about what I believe. I believe the Bible is true. And if I truly believe the Bible said women are second-class citizens and less than men, I would like to think I would admit that.
Mm.
I don't believe that. And I defy anybody to actually try to prove that, um, either from the Bible or from even like Talmud and rabbinic literature. I
Mm.
don't think that is true. And honestly, part of that is the Jewish insistence that a human being is not whole until they are married.
Mm.
It a whole human being, like it says, right? B'Tselem Elokim bara otam, right? God created them in the image of God, male and female. He created it, right?
Mm.
The being a complete image of God is being a man and woman together. And that's why the most holy and godly thing that we do as human beings is produce children, right? A man and a woman together create a human being. That is theosis. That is being like God, right? And I mean, obviously, Christianity has certain problems with that concept of it. Um, I mean, so this the number one answer to people who, for example, Luke tells me that you know, Jesus was the perfect embodiment, incarnation of God, and my answer is he wasn't married, he wasn't female. How can the perfect incarnation of the image of God be a man? And honestly, frankly, I don't think it's true that Jesus wasn't married, but that's a whole other thing. Uh, look, if he wasn't married, I think it would have become an issue that would have been brought up in the Gospels, but it wasn't. So, but that's a whole other thing. Um, but honestly, if you have a biblical view of what God is, and that view of God does not include the feminine, does not include females, then you're just blatantly dismissing Genesis. Because Genesis quite clearly says that the image of God is masculine and feminine. How do you deal with that verse? And actually, I mean, I don't know if you watched Sam's discussion with Bo and Isaiah.
Mm-mm.
Really good discussion, but the best part of that discussion was where Bo started explaining, and I think it was a little bit too mathematical, that when we do this thing of um, bringing up different verses for our position, right? Well, if you really have so many different verses for different positions and these do not reconcile, then it's not just a fight you're having about what the Bible says. To some extent, you're arguing for the Bart Ehrman position, which is that the Bible is incoherent,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So if there are actually all these conflicts and the Bible is contradicting itself left and right, then maybe the answer is, and I think to some extent we have to entertain that idea, that if it's actually all contradictory, then this is not a unified holy text. This is not God speaking to us.
Mm.
So this idea of saying, well, oh, you have this verse and I have this verse, and maybe if I find 5 verses here and you find 3 there, I win. It's like, no, no, no. You have to believe in the Bible as a unified whole that is teaching something specific. And if there are these contradictions that are actually contradictions, which I don't think there are actual contradictions, I think the Bible is teaching us something with each verse, then you have to take this verse seriously. Why did God think that it was important to include that verse? Male and female created he them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I have problems with some of the argumentation and sort of this isolated verse and pulling things out and how these conversations go. Not that I don't think that they can be important or that they shouldn't happen. That's not my argument, but I do think that there is, um, for some Christians, a lot of disrespect in the cultural surroundings and like the depth of where these things are coming from. And there's often this m- modern lens from both atheists and Christians or religious people where they put their conceptions of what that text says and then therefore making it say that's what it means without taking the responsibility to go back and say, hey, these are ancient texts that are from a certain time period and a certain culture, and to fully understand what's going on and work through these contradictions, we have to acknowledge that and do our best to try and think through that lens before we come to strong opinions about what this means and how it all fits. And so I think for a lot of that becomes the issue. As far as sort of the Christian perspective on marriage, I do think there is that view that man and women coming together is sort of this full embodiment of God. Um, I think they also tend to believe that there can be, um, through Jesus and all of that. And I know you don't see that part of it, but there's this new way of life of showing that outside of that we can also understand what it means to be truly human. But I do think, and maybe not in every Christian form, but I do think in a lot of Christianity, there still is that respect that men and women together create the full picture and help us understand fully what it means to be God, and like the opposites of these two things, the beauty of those extreme things coming together being one, soften us and help us see more fully where we are deficient and find ways to see the world in these different ways. And so, um yeah, I mean, I'd have to, I don't know um enough about sort of, I guess, the full Jewish perspective in that way and how different it is from Christianity. But I do know that that does exist within that, um, depending on your traditions.
Well, I will say that, Genesis 1:27, the Hebrew is actually very, very interesting in
Mm,
ways that I don't think translates very well to English.
mm,
So I would definitely recommend people who are interested in this whole concept of the masculine and feminine in terms of theology. I would say look look at Genesis 1:27 in the Hebrew, word for word, and I think it's saying something profound,
mm,
and I think it's something that doesn't unfortunately translate to the English. I won't put you to sleep with all of Hebrew grammar, but there is a what's called a direct object marker in Hebrew, which doesn't exist in most other languages, unfortunately.
mm,
And so it doesn't translate to other languages. And because of that, um, one of the reasons I put so much stress on learning Hebrew itself is because I think a lot of the disagreements, theological disagreements we have about how to understand the Bible derives from looking at translations. And
mm,
anytime you look at a translation, you're looking at a human understanding, which I think is inherently uh, flawed in ways that the original word of God, I don't think is.
mm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I definitely think for me, especially in the last several years, I've really gotten much more respect for and much more caution in sort of this idea of looking at an English translation and feeling confident I know what it means because there's so much um, depth into all these words. I actually have a friend who goes to my Orthodox parish, um, and she actually used to uh, teach Hebrew um, for I don't know if it was like a Jewish school or something, and she was talking about how when you really read it in the original language, there's so much more context and life in those things than we can fully get from just reading these translations. And there's so much going on in there. And I do think there's something very Western about our confidence in the Bibles that we have and the way that they're translated and knowing that that's what it means. Yeah, on all sides of the spectrum of religious perception. And I think it's doing a disservice to really understanding what these texts are.
Right. And honestly, I mean, in the Hebrew, I a lot of things um, are in fact vague in Hebrew in ways that are actually amazing.
Mm,
You know, and you one of the things for me, I one of the reasons I don't think within Judaism there's been as much of a struggle with Genesis and um, the 7 days of creation and exactly it seems that the creation versus evolution debate has been a very central part of the deconstruction of a lot of Christians. And in Judaism, I think part of what alleviates that is Genesis 1 is one of the most poetic texts
mm,
in the entire Bible,
mm-hmm,
right? The alliteration and just the language of it, right, is so obviously poetic in Hebrew. And that they actually did a study. I saw somebody did a study of like alliteration as a score because in Hebrew poetry is alliterative, right? It's
mm,
not rhyming, it's alliteration.
mm,
And they actually did a score, and I believe if it's not like if Genesis 1 and 2 isn't the most alliterative part of the Bible, it's definitely one of it.
Yeah.
So that simply doesn't translate. And when you're listening to a poetic text, it's a lot more comfortable for you to say that this doesn't need to be taken literally because it is poetic, and it becomes less of a problem.
Yeah. No, and I think there are more and more people within Christianity, especially sort of in Protestantism, trying to form that understanding, and try to get people to see it as this poetic thing that it is. Because I think there is something, and well, I guess I kind of know why it's very Protestant, but this sort of Protestant fundamentalism where it tries to make it some sort of science textbook or something it isn't trying to be. And so I think there is sort of a movement to try to correct those things. But we'll see how it goes. I think truth eventually outlasts the things that aren't true. So hopefully, as time goes on, those things will come back and reemerge, and we'll be able to see more people understanding the truth of those things. But um, people are
So
interesting with religion.
so let's beat up on the Reformation a bit more.
I okay. Here's my struggle with talking about Protestantism, because I no longer am Protestant. I grew up Protestant. My dad is, I guess, Calvinist. Um, my mom fights being a Calvinist and not. um, but I don't want to badmouth it, because I'm very grateful for what Protestant gave me in a love for God and a seeking for truth, and for the spark of which got me to believe in religion and God. Um, but I also think it's wrong. And I also think there's a lot of things that aren't actually helping in spiritual formation. And when I was a Protestant, I felt fine challenging it, because, it was part of my team. It's like, hey guys, let's do better. But now that I don't identify, it feels too much like I'm like tearing it down. And I don't want to do that, because I definitely understand the reasoning why someone would be Protestant. And I understand the way that works out, and the why of why people are doing it. And so I try to be careful about how I attack it. And I don't even want to say attack it, how I point out the flaws I see in it.
Oh, I definitely hear you. I mean, I have this ambivalence. I There's a part of me that just wants John Calvin to be known as the murderer. I think that should be his nickname, John Calvin, the murderer. Um, but at the same time, one thing that I've noticed, especially in the Noahide movement, which is a lot of former Christians who have embraced Judaism,
Mm,
um, a lot there is a bitterness that's incredibly unhealthy.
mhm.
Like they there's a lot of them are very, very angry at Christianity.
Yeah.
Um, and I just, it is so unhealthy that honestly, there's a few people, especially on my Discord server, who are questioning Christianity, and they don't know where they fit. And I I haven't been able to recommend um, joining these Noahide communities, because I just think they're just so bitter.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, and you see a lot of these ex evangelicals, most of them atheists, and I guess I would be one of those. I'm an ex evangelical, but there is so much animosity to it, and there's so much vitriol that I think it actually clouds them from seeing things as they are and like really trying to get to the place of understanding. And in one way, I can sympathize with that. I think there's a lot of pain and sort of spiritual death that has been brought about by some of these religious movements. Um, but yeah, I really don't want to be a part of the othering. I'm not here to call people out or tell them they're stupid. I want to believe things that are true, and I want to stand for those things, and I want to question myself when I'm believing something, whether it's true or not. But I don't see goodness, life, or beauty coming from that spirit. And so that there's a part of me that um, is ingrained in me. I can be a very sassy person. I can be very argumentative, and so I try. I really just don't like to be around it or feed it because I'm very aware of the potential that I could to get there and be there, and I don't want to be that. And I've experienced negativity in, you know, Protestantism. Um, but I also recognize that all of that was done in good intention, and it doesn't mean that it's right, but at least I can forgive it and sort of work my mind around it, and just recognize like we're all in these journeys, and sometimes like the things that are deeply ingrained in what we believe affect the way that we act. And when it's Protestantism and all about the idea of what I can formulate in my head and how I believe that determines the health of my spirituality, it makes you act in some weird ways.
Yeah, I think part of the problem here is we currently live in a society that's very, very unwilling to criticize some things which really do need to be criticized.
Yeah, I
We
agree.
we don't reject some things the way that we should. 2 plus 2 equals 5. Just there has to be a place where you say no. 2 plus 2 is 4.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, it's a hard it's a hard balance
Yeah.
to find.
Yeah, and I'm totally in that place where I don't think that we should placate untruth. I don't think it's a thing where, we should pretend things are true that aren't, or shy away from saying what we believe is true because we don't want to hurt somebody's feelings or whatever, because there's implications to believing things that are wrong. um but I also think that there is this real temptation to play that game, um and make it a pride thing, where it's like I'm defending my truth over yours and I have the truth and not. And I, knowing myself, like I just know that I am definitely have the personality to get into that game and be that kind of person. And when I really think about it, I don't want to be that. And I do challenge, even with my family, I've started to kind of make challenges about Protestantism. For a while, I just was like, I'm gonna do my orthodoxy, and I'm just gonna keep moving towards it and do that. But I've started to kind of make little challenges here and there about it. And it's just kind of deciding the where and when of where I start to question those things and make those challenges. And I'm still learning the right balance of it.
I think part of the problem is that our society has has lost that feeling of there's a difference between things you say for public consumption in front of everybody
Hmm.
and the things that you are speaking interpersonally. Just, you know, um, there's a lot of people who think that what I say to you when we're just talking, the two of us, should be the exact same as what the two of us would say to each other if, when we know we are recording this for more public consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that everybody does have a recorder in their pocket, that a lot of our conversations are texts or emails or direct messages that can be shared, I think has made it very difficult. A lot of people think that that's being two-faced.
Mm.
I don't think that's right.
Mm.
It's not about being two-faced. It's about speaking to the people you're speaking with. And if I'm speaking to just Cassidy, or if I'm speaking to Cassidy and Sam and Luke and the other people, or I'm speaking to everybody in the whole world, it makes sense that what I say, how I say it, how much I reveal, how these should reflect different things. And for some reason, our society is convinced that a person who does that is not is being deceptive and inauthentic. And I
Mm.
just think that's just really wrong.
Right. I think there's a place where it could have the potential to be, but it doesn't mean that it always is. But I think there's also something too where just recognizing that even when people are speaking the same language, we aren't always communicating the same way. I was like a communication major before I switched to filmmaking. And that was something we really learned about. Like, there's different communication styles. Some people are more confrontational, some people are avoiders. And when you get a confronter and an avoider together, it creates some chaos. And it's just these different ways of conversing or solving issues, or even the words that we use. They don't always mean the same thing to everyone, because we bring our baggage to those things. And it's not that those words don't have actual meanings, but we also bring meaning to those words. And it's easy to get caught up on the surface level instead of digging through those things. And so there's these sort of ways that people participate that can often look one way, but be totally different. And um, like I'll point to sort of like you on the Discord. You have a bit of a reputation for being fiery, and when I laughed a little bit when you're like, I'm not afraid to say my opinion, because like anybody on the Discord who knows you knows that that is very true. You're no shame on saying what your opinion is, but there's certain people that you'll communicate with. If you came into it blindly and didn't know who you were, who you were talking to, you would seem like mortal enemies. But for people who have seen the pattern of how you communicate and how you talk, you recognize, oh no, Jacob's just bold and blunt and not easily offended. And that comes away in his communication style. And then you'll like you recognize that sometimes the things that on the outside look like um com- like complete enemies are actually this engagement in something deeper, and there's like a deeper friendship within all of those things. And so it's just funny to think about those things and the way we communicate, and how those things can really get twisted or misused and give people judgments or character associations of a whole different variety of things, because that's just, as humans, how we want to react.
I'm just thinking of all this stuff, like people, somebody right before the fishing trip, somebody sarcastically said in on the Discord server, I think Jacob and Charlie should go fishing. And that person was, I believe, being sarcastic. And I'm like, hold on, were you making a joke? Because we are going fishing like next weekend. And they're like, really? I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
and one thing about having recorded conversations, listening to them over again, I sometimes it becomes very clear that either the person I was talking to didn't understand what I was saying, or I didn't understand what that person was saying.
Right.
Right. And so the conversation ends up going off in weird ways,
Uh-huh.
um, partially because of that. Uh, it makes me wonder how many times there wasn't a record of the conversation
Mm.
and we misunderstood each other.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that makes me think that, oh, well, maybe emails and texts are more clear, but
Mm.
they're not. And that's another thing I've noticed. Like, I will go back and reread conversations, and I try to always read everything people write to me, but part of the problem with the fact I type 70 words a minute, and you can tell, right? And part of the problem with me writing as much as I do is I think a lot of people just skim or skip over. And that just, I mean, when you're talking to somebody on voice, like we are, as much time as I spend speaking is as much time as you have to spend listening.
Mm.
Whereas with text, that's just not the case.
Well, and there's a whole idea of inflection and body language that adds to all of that, where you don't get that in text. Like at the beginning of the episode, when you were talking about some of, um, the things about women and being a sexist and all those things, that would have come off very differently over text than it did voice, and it wouldn't have been as easy to kind of poke and prod and get to the bottom of what you were actually saying, in a back and forth text chat versus a conversation.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know, and I think there is something too about just bringing it back to the masculine and feminine of men and women having these very different communication styles, and obviously there's outliers with those things, but trying to find ways to make those come together and understand what's actually going on. It's very complicated in a lot of different levels, and I do think erasing the gender differences is not going to help that conversation. I mean, I always find myself sort of torn in a place where it's like, you know, I I've seen some of these ways where people are trying to protect women and be nice to women that end up potentially being, I guess, sexist or harmful in a bad way, not just distinguishing between sexes, but that actually don't help, and can really get twisted and into what the potential is, which is this idea of protecting women. But I also recognize there's this whole other side where the way that feminism is going and the way that it has, um, sort of adapted is not helping women as much as we think. And in some ways it's not creating the equality of genders. It's actually trying to flip the script and make the women the top of the hierarchy. And I don't think that's the helpful thing to do either.
Yeah, one thing, I mean, especially talking to younger men who are kind of looking for a bit of, you know, avuncular guidance. One of the things I've had to say to them um, often has been, ignore all the bullshit that our culture is feeding them about how to treat women, because honestly, so many of them are, I mean, several people have come to me and they're like, I don't understand. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and that's not what women want. It's like,
Right.
you're right. what our society tells men, how our society tells men to treat women is not what women want. And unless you're willing to actually be explicit about that to some people, they're just, I mean, I honestly, I think it affected me as I was growing up, especially because I was coming from a very different culture, and becoming acculturated in the United States as an immigrant. English was my third language. I took a lot of the official guidance at face value, and again, we're lying to our young people, we're lying to each other, and a lot of people are kind of like, well, we all know it's with a wink and a nod, right? But honestly, have you heard about these consent apps?
No.
So apparently there are now apps for getting like written sexual consent before you have sex. So it's like you have it on your phone, she has it on her phone, and the two of you like get it in writing before you have sex.
Well, there's a pragmatism to that, I
There is.
suppose.
Um, funnily, funnily enough, it actually reminds me of like you should get married before sex.
That's what I was just gonna say. Well, that's what a marriage certificate is, right?
Pretty much. But
I mean, there's
again,
gray area there.
right? You say that, and people are like, "What do you mean? There's spousal rape?" And it's like, yeah, you know what? Human relationships can't be explicit like that. They just can't.
Yeah. Well, and I don't think most people live quite that way. But yeah, I don't know. Well, I think there's a lot in sort of general culture and media that tell these narratives of what women are supposed to want, like sell stories of what women should want and how, what's going to make us free and liberated. And not that I necessarily think they are lying on purpose, but I do think there's a lot of lies in that. And that's creating another harm in itself. So men are being lied to, women are being lied to. And now we already don't know what each other actually wants, but it just makes that harder because the thing culturally that we're told we want is just not actually what we want.
I don't know how much you watch Benjamin Boyce's channel. I I it's hit and miss, but I tried watching this one thing where he had this woman on who he had gotten into like a Twitter tiff with,
Mm.
and her whole point was, is it too much to ask for there to be no rapes? And Benjamin would not just say, yes, of course that's too much to ask. We're never going to have a world in which there are no murders, no rapes, no, it's like she's like, I want there to be zero rapes. And it's like, that's not going to happen. I'm sorry. I mean, when the Messiah shows up, maybe, but until that time, if you're living in reality, you realize, guess what? We're not going to be in a zero murder society. And the only way to even approach it would be a sort of authoritarianism that's actually scary. And you're not an adult. And frankly, I mean, I couldn't even listen to it until the end, because the whole time I just wanted Benjamin to say to her, you're not an adult. This is ridiculous. What you're asking is something that no intelligent human being should should actually anticipate being a possibility. But he wasn't going to do that. That's not what Benjamin Boyce does, even if
But
he
not
is the voice of reason.
well, it's probably not what I would have done either, Jacob. You're a rare breed where you feel comfortable being able to say that and do that. Maybe not Rhea. There are other people, but you know, different
Well,
styles.
it depends. I mean, I'm not sure I would say that to somebody if it's just the two of us sitting, you know, at a table talking. But it just, for me, the idea that thousands of people are sitting there listening to somebody say something that stupid, and I mean it, and I think it's important to say that. It's just a very idiotic thing that no adult human being, you know, that proposition, right, should be something that we as adults, you know, go, yeah, that's not a society we can live in. That's not something we can aim at. It's utopian in the most ridiculous way. And an adult human being should know that.
Well, it's the difference between being idealistic and principled, where it's like idealists want the utopia, where principled people want the sort of participation in culture that leads towards less of evil. But I think outside of religion, a lot of people don't see or want to acknowledge this idea of the evil that lies in humanity and the fall of what we do as we participate in these cycles of death. And yeah, so it gets to this place where it's like, well, it should be easy, but we don't recognize that there's a real um that there's something deep in the evil that lies in the world and the way it can consume people. And it doesn't mean that it's good, but like we have to recognize that it exists. And so how do we create principles that help us and the communities around us avoid that evil as much as we can, to reduce it as much as we can?
Right. Yeah, that I think, you know, this whole idea that wokeism is a religion that doesn't recognize the fallen world, doesn't recognize any sort of, you know, redemption, that doesn't, it it is a crippled religion.
Mm.
And they, honestly, it's far more dangerous and far worse than anything that Sam Harris and the New Atheists think religion has led to.
I don't know if they would agree. Maybe they would agree. I don't know.
I
But
would
I think
hope that Dawkins, I mean, Richard Dawkins, he's been getting his comeuppance on that front, left and right. He, and honestly, I mean, I I've been very disappointed in Sam Harris because he doesn't seem to get it. Um, Richard Dawkins, I thought, was kind of moving that way, but yeah, they seem to have been possessed by this woke atheist ideology in such a way. Uh, yeah, I don't know what's going to happen.
oh, no one does. We just gotta keep pressing on, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, any last words or final thoughts about this topic? We covered a lot of different things, and you're definitely one of the most bold and controversial people I've had on.
Well, I'm hoping you don't get canceled. I actually got my video demonetized on Rumble.
Hmm.
I'm not even monetized on any, I don't think on anything, but I noticed my video on gay marriage got demonetized on Rumble. So I've been pre-canceled, and I hope I don't rub off on your channel. Feel free to edit any of this.
No, I'll probably leave it on. Here is my deal. Even if I don't agree with what someone says, like I still recognize they have a right to say it, and to shut them down and yell at them and say they're stupid and ignorant and bigoted is not helping anything. And so, like there has to be some sort of engagement and understanding and like coming to a place. And I know you, I don't think that what you're saying is coming from a place where you're trying to demean people or belittle people or
Except the
create
stupid
chaos.
people. there's just some people who need to not be in the public discussion.
Well, either way, I think for me, you know, to have you on and to let you have that position does not necessarily mean that I then agree with everything you're saying. I mean, obviously, there's a lot I don't agree with. I'm an Orthodox Christian catechumen, and you're a non-practicing Orthodox Jew. Right there, there's going to be a million differences, and I think anybody who knows us does know we have different ways in which we communicate with conflict, especially on the Discord through text. So, like, but I think for me, that's part of it. It's not shying away from things that could potentially be cancelable. Is that how you would say that word? Probably not.
Let's call it unwoke.
I mean, I don't necessarily consider myself woke. I wouldn't consider myself anti-woke. I definitely see its problems, but I also understand the why behind it and have lots of friends who are very woke. And, I respect that some of the caricatures that are placed on wokeness are that caricatures are not the full picture. So there's, I'm an interesting breed of a person. I'm not easily categorized. And, I'm low in agreeability and high in openness. And it creates this weird dichotomy within me.
That's what we love about you.
Thank you. It's my one charm. All right. Well, so anything left to say?
That's it. I don't have anything to say more to say today. If people want to hear more of my rants, they're available all over YouTube.
All right. Well, with that, I'll close it off. Thanks, Jacob. I appreciate you chatting. Thank you so much for watching. I hope I don't get canceled. If I have, it was wonderful knowing you all. If not, I will see you next week. But like always, I will close with the Serenity Prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.